Marcus had always been different from other children his age. While many kids in his neighborhood spent their afternoons playing basketball in the park or glued to their video games, Marcus had a different kind of fascination. From the time he was 6 years old, he had fallen in love with airplanes. The way they rose into the sky, the sound of their engines, the way they seemed so heavy on the ground but so graceful once they were airborne, it all felt like magic to him. He lived in a modest neighborhood not far from the regional airport, and that was a blessing in disguise. Most people in the area thought of the airport as a noisy inconvenience. Planes flew low, rattling windows and making it difficult to hear the television at times. But Marcus never minded the noise. To him, every sound of an engine taking off or landing was like music. He would often stop in the middle of his homework just to rush to his bedroom window and watch a jet soaring above the rooftops. His passion didn't go unnoticed. His father, David, knew just how much his son admired aviation. At home, David was a caring father who tried to spend as much time as possible with Marcus despite his demanding career. At work, David was someone else entirely. Few people in the neighborhood knew his true role. He wasn't just an ordinary office worker, he was one of the senior administrators at the Federal Aviation Administration, an agency that shaped aviation policies across the country. He had spent decades working his way up in the field, and he knew how much responsibility rested on his shoulders. But at home, he preferred to keep life simple. He was just Dad, the one who cooked Saturday morning pancakes and told Marcus stories about the first time he ever rode in an airplane. He never tried to pressure his son into following his career path, but it made him proud to see Marcus so curious about the world of aviation. He often brought home books, magazines, and small souvenirs from airports he visited. One of Marcus's favorite possessions was a small model airplane his father had given him after a conference. He kept it on his nightstand, polishing it carefully whenever he had the chance. Marcus's mother also supported his dream, though she sometimes worried that her son's imagination carried him too far. He would spend hours sketching airplanes in his notebook, sometimes forgetting to eat his lunch. When asked what he wanted to be when he grew up, Marcus didn't hesitate: a pilot. He said it with so much certainty that no one dared to argue. Every afternoon after school, Marcus had a routine. He would toss his backpack on the couch, grab his notebook, and hop on his bicycle. He rode carefully along the familiar streets that led toward the airport. There was a spot near the chain-link fence, close enough to see the runway but still safe on public ground, where he loved to sit. From there, he could watch the planes taxi, take off, and land. He would copy down the tail numbers into his notebook, carefully labeling each one. It was a hobby called plane spotting, something many aviation enthusiasts practiced around the world. But for Marcus, it wasn't just a hobby, it was his training ground. He imagined that each tail number was part of a bigger story. Where had the plane come from? Who were the people inside it? Was there a child like him, pressing his face against the window in awe as the plane landed? These questions filled his imagination and made him feel like he was part of a larger adventure. At school, his classmates didn't always understand. Some teased him for spending his time watching airplanes instead of playing sports. Others thought it was boring. But Marcus never let their comments bother him. He carried his notebook everywhere, and when teachers gave assignments about hobbies or dreams, his essays always revolved around aviation. His teachers admired his focus and often encouraged him to pursue his passion. One day, Marcus's teacher invited a guest speaker, a local flight instructor, to talk to the class about careers in aviation. The moment the instructor walked into the room, Marcus's eyes lit up. He listened more carefully than anyone else, asking questions about how planes stay in the air, what it takes to get a pilot's license, and how many hours one needed to fly before becoming a captain. After class, the instructor pulled David aside and said, "Your son is special. If he keeps this passion alive, he could go very far." David felt a swell of pride. He knew his son's dream wasn't just a passing phase. Marcus had determination, curiosity, and a heart full of wonder. Those were qualities that could carry him anywhere. Still, David also knew the world was not always kind, and he sometimes worried about how Marcus might be treated in spaces where young black boys were not often seen. But he kept those concerns to himself, choosing instead to nurture his son's love of aviation and give him as many opportunities as possible. On weekends, David sometimes drove Marcus to larger airports just so he could watch bigger jets. They would sit in the car together, eating sandwiches while watching planes line up on the runway. Marcus asked endless questions, and David answered patiently, sharing little bits of aviation knowledge without overwhelming him. It was during one of these trips that Marcus declared, "One day, I'll fly one of those." David smiled, knowing that his son meant every word. By the time Marcus turned 12, his notebooks were filled with sketches, notes, and lists of tail numbers. He had memorized airline names, models of aircraft, and even details about airports in other cities. His room was decorated with posters of airplanes and shelves of aviation books his father had collected over the years. It was clear to anyone who visited that this boy's world revolved around flight. Life felt peaceful, almost predictable. Each day seemed to bring a small moment of joy, whether it was seeing a new plane he hadn't spotted before or learning a new fact about aviation. Marcus was happy in his world of dreams, believing that with hard work and patience, he could one day step into a cockpit and take command of an aircraft. But what Marcus didn't know was that his passion, so innocent and pure, would soon place him in a situation that tested not only his love for aviation but also the very way people around him judged who he was. It would happen on an ordinary afternoon, in the same spot by the airport fence, with his notebook and pencil in hand. And it would begin with a single glance from a pilot who misunderstood what he saw. For now, though, Marcus was just a boy with a big dream, a bicycle that carried him to the edge of the runway, and a heart full of sky. The day started like any other for Marcus. The sun was bright, the air carried the smell of freshly cut grass, and the sound of engines overhead filled him with excitement. He had finished his homework early, packed his usual notebook and pencil into his backpack, and hopped onto his bicycle. His mother reminded him not to be late for dinner, and he promised with a quick smile before pedaling away. Marcus knew exactly where he was going. The chain-link fence near the airport had become his favorite spot. It wasn't just about watching planes anymore, it was about feeling connected to the world beyond his neighborhood. Each aircraft that lifted off seemed like a giant arrow pointing toward adventure. He imagined the passengers inside, some visiting family, some starting new jobs, others maybe traveling for the first time. To Marcus, every flight had a story, and his notebook was where he captured them. He arrived at the fence and parked his bike against a post. The afternoon sun reflected off the metal, making it warm to the touch. Marcus sat cross-legged on the grass, opened his notebook, and carefully wrote down the tail number of a jet taxiing across the runway. His pencil moved quickly as he added details about the aircraft type and the time of departure. He was so focused that he barely noticed a figure standing some distance away, watching him. That figure was a pilot preparing for his flight. He was older, dressed neatly in his crisp uniform, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone used to being in control. From where he stood, he noticed the boy by the fence scribbling notes while looking at planes. The pilot's brow furrowed. He didn't recognize the boy, and without thinking much, his mind jumped to conclusions. He wondered why a child would be sitting so close to the runway, writing things down. Marcus, unaware of the attention he had attracted, kept scribbling. A large jet began its takeoff roll, engines roaring as it gained speed. His eyes widened, and he quickly wrote down every detail. He loved the way the plane seemed to fight gravity at first before suddenly leaping into the sky. For Marcus, moments like that were pure magic. The pilot, however, didn't see magic. He saw something unusual, something he thought needed to be reported. Instead of approaching the boy with a friendly question, he walked back toward the terminal and called airport security. In a calm but firm voice, he explained that there was a young boy near the fence taking notes about airplanes. He suggested it might be suspicious and should be checked immediately. Minutes later, Marcus heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. A police car pulled up near the fence, and his heart skipped a beat. He looked up from his notebook, confused. Two officers stepped out, their expression serious. They walked toward him quickly, their eyes scanning the notebook in his lap. "Hey, what are you doing here?" one of the officers asked. His tone wasn't angry, but it wasn't gentle either. Marcus blinked, unsure of how to answer. He looked down at his notebook, then back up at the officer. I'm just writing down the numbers on the planes," Marcus replied softly. "It's my hobby. I like airplanes." The second officer crossed his arms. "Why are you writing them down? Who told you to do this?" "No one," Marcus said quickly. "I just do it because I like it. I want to be a pilot one day." The officers exchanged glances. The first officer leaned down slightly, eyeing the notebook. He saw neat handwriting, rows of numbers, small drawings of airplanes. To him, it looked harmless. But the report they had received from the pilot made them cautious. Meanwhile, Marcus felt a knot forming in his stomach. He wasn't sure why they were questioning him. He had been coming to this spot for months, and no one had ever bothered him before. His palms began to sweat as he clutched the notebook to his chest, as if afraid they might take it away. Behind the police car, the pilot appeared. He stood with his arms folded, watching the scene closely. His face carried the look of someone certain he had done the right thing. To him, it didn't matter that the boy was young. What mattered was that he thought something wasn't right, and now the officers were handling it. Marcus tried to explain again. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I just write down the numbers so I can learn about the planes. That's all." But his words seemed too small against the weight of suspicion hanging in the air. The officers continued asking questions: where he lived, why he came here, who his parents were. Each question made Marcus more nervous, though he answered truthfully. His notebook, once a symbol of his dreams, now felt like evidence of something he didn't understand. As the minutes passed, a small group of airport staff and bystanders gathered at a distance. Some whispered to each other, wondering why the police were questioning a boy with a notebook. Others simply watched in silence, unsure of what was happening. Marcus shifted uncomfortably on the grass. The excitement he had felt only minutes earlier had drained away, replaced by confusion and worry. He thought of his father and how he always encouraged him to follow his dream. He wished his dad were there to explain that he wasn't doing anything wrong. The officers, uncertain of what to do, began discussing whether to take Marcus to the station for further questions. They hadn't found anything dangerous, but they also hadn't dismissed the pilot's concern. Marcus's heart sank at the thought. He had never been in trouble before, not at school, not at home, and certainly not with the police. He felt his throat tighten as he tried one more time to explain. "Please. I just like planes," he whispered. "That's all I'm doing. I'm not hurting anyone." The officers didn't respond right away. They stood in silence, considering their next step. The pilot, still standing nearby, nodded as if to say, "See, I told you something was wrong." In that moment, the joy of watching airplanes, the thing Marcus loved most, was overshadowed by a cloud of doubt and fear. What had started as a peaceful afternoon with his notebook had turned into a situation he never expected. He didn't know it yet, but help was on the way. And it would arrive in a way that none of the people standing there could have imagined. The late afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the runway. Marcus sat nervously on the grass, still holding his notebook tightly in his lap. The two officers stood nearby, their radios crackling softly, while the pilot hovered just behind them with an air of authority. The once exciting day had turned into a nightmare Marcus never could have imagined. Inside his chest, his heart beat fast. He wondered what his father would say if he saw him like this. His father always reminded him to stay calm in difficult moments, to use his voice and explain clearly if he ever found himself misunderstood. Marcus tried that already, but it didn't seem to help. No one believed that he was just a boy fascinated by airplanes. The officers were still debating what to do when another airport worker, a security guard Marcus had seen before, walked past the fence. The guard recognized him instantly. "Hey, that's the kid who's always here," the guard called out. "He just writes numbers in his notebook. He doesn't bother anyone." Marcus felt a flicker of relief, but it didn't last long. The pilot shook his head firmly. "You never know," he insisted. "Better to be safe. We can't just allow anyone to sit by the fence writing things down. That could be dangerous." The guard looked unsure, but he didn't argue further. The police officers nodded, as though the pilot's words carried weight. They turned back to Marcus and asked again, "Who's responsible for you? Where's your father?" Marcus hesitated. His father was busy most of the time, often away in meetings or working late. But he also knew his father cared deeply about him and would want to be there now. With a shaky voice, Marcus gave them his father's phone number. One of the officers stepped aside to make the call. Meanwhile, Marcus sat silently, staring down at the grass. He felt small, almost invisible, as if his dream of flying one day had suddenly shrunk into something fragile that could be taken away at any moment. His eyes filled with tears, but he quickly blinked them back. He didn't want to cry in front of strangers. The minutes stretched on. The officer returned, speaking quietly to his partner. They glanced at Marcus but didn't explain what was happening. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Marcus saw a familiar car pull up near the fence. His heart leapt. His father was here. David stepped out of the car, dressed in his usual business attire. His presence was calm yet commanding, the kind of presence that made people pause and take notice. He walked quickly toward the group, his eyes moving from the officers to his son. For a moment, his face softened with concern as he saw Marcus clutching the notebook like a lifeline. "Marcus," David said gently, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Are you all right?" Marcus nodded, though his voice trembled when he answered. "They think I'm doing something wrong, Dad. But I was just writing down the plane numbers." David gave his son a reassuring look before turning to the officers. His tone shifted, still polite, but steady and firm. "Can someone explain to me why my child is being treated like this?" The officers straightened slightly, caught off guard by the quiet authority in his voice. The pilot stepped forward quickly, eager to defend his decision. "I noticed the boy writing down information about planes. It looked suspicious. In these times, you can't be too careful. I called it in for safety reasons." David listened without interrupting. When the pilot finished, he took a slow breath and said, "I understand the importance of safety. Believe me, I've spent my entire career ensuring it. But what you see here is not a threat, it's a 12-year-old boy with a dream." The officers exchanged glances, clearly uncertain. One of them asked, "And you are?" David reached into his pocket and calmly presented his identification. The badge of the Federal Aviation Administration gleamed in the sunlight. He spoke clearly, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "I am David, administrator with the FAA. My responsibility is aviation safety at the highest level. And this is my son." The silence that followed was heavy. The officers' eyes widened as they looked at the badge, then back at Marcus, and then at David again. Even the pilot, who had seemed so sure of himself moments earlier, shifted uncomfortably on his feet. David continued, his voice steady. My son has a passion for aviation. He comes here often to watch the planes, just as many children do. He writes numbers because he dreams of becoming a pilot one day. There is nothing suspicious about a child pursuing his passion. Marcus listened, his heart swelling with pride as his father spoke. For the first time since the officers arrived, he felt safe. His father wasn't just defending him, he was making the truth clear in a way that no one could ignore. The officers quickly softened their tone. "We didn't realize," one of them said. "We received a call and had to check it out. We meant no harm." But David wasn't finished. He looked directly at the pilot, his expression calm but firm. "You made a judgment without asking a single question. Instead of walking up to a boy and saying, 'What are you doing?' you chose to assume the worst. Do you realize what that feels like for a child?" The pilot's face reddened. His confidence from earlier seemed to melt away under the weight of David's words. He opened his mouth to respond but then closed it again, unable to find the right explanation. David didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His quiet authority carried more strength than anger ever could. Airports should be places of inspiration as well as safety. Children like my son are the future of aviation. If we treat their curiosity as a threat, we crush their dreams before they have a chance to take flight. The words hung in the air, powerful and undeniable. The officers nodded slowly, clearly understanding. The pilot shifted uneasily, looking down at his polished shoes. David turned back to Marcus and crouched beside him. "You're not in trouble, son. You didn't do anything wrong. Don't ever let anyone make you feel ashamed for following your dream." Marcus nodded, his eyes shining. He felt the fear lifting away, replaced by the familiar warmth of hope. His father's presence had changed everything. The officers excused themselves quietly, realizing the situation was resolved. The small crowd that had gathered began to disperse, though whispers lingered in the air. The pilot remained for a moment longer, his shoulders tense, as if weighing whether to apologize. But before he could speak, David simply gave him a polite nod, a silent reminder that respect begins with understanding. As the car door closed and Marcus sat beside his father on the drive home, he let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The notebook still rested in his lap, its pages filled with the same neat rows of numbers, now carrying a new meaning. To him, it was no longer just a collection of tail numbers, it was proof of resilience. Proof that even when misunderstood, his passion remained strong. David glanced at his son and offered a small smile. "You see, Marcus. Sometimes people won't understand your dream. But what matters is that you keep holding on to it. One day, they'll see it as clearly as you do." Marcus looked out the window as another plane soared high above the horizon. The roar of its engines filled him with renewed determination. His dream hadn't been crushed, it had only grown stronger. The ride home was quiet at first. Marcus sat with his notebook still in his lap, his fingers brushing the edges of the pages as though he needed to remind himself it was real. His father drove steadily, his eyes on the road, his face calm but thoughtful. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was the kind of silence that gave both of them space to think. Finally, Marcus spoke. "Dad. I wasn't doing anything wrong, right?" His voice was small, as if he was afraid of the answer. David glanced at him and shook his head firmly. "No, son. You weren't doing anything wrong at all. You were doing what you love. That's never wrong." Marcus let out a breath of relief, but doubt still tugged at his heart. "Then why did they treat me like that?" David's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. He chose his words carefully, his voice gentle but honest. "Sometimes, people make judgments without knowing the whole story. They see something and assume the worst instead of asking questions. It's not fair, but it happens. What matters is how we respond." Marcus nodded slowly. He didn't fully understand everything, but he trusted his father's words. When they arrived home, Marcus's mother was waiting at the door. She had received a call from David on the way and already knew what had happened. She pulled Marcus into a hug so tight he could hardly breathe. "Are you all right, baby?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm okay, Mom," Marcus whispered, though the memory of the police car still sat heavy in his mind. That evening, they sat down for dinner as usual, but the conversation lingered on the incident. David explained what had happened in detail, making sure Marcus's mother understood that their son had done nothing wrong. She listened quietly, occasionally glancing at Marcus with worry in her eyes. By the end of the meal, she placed her hand over Marcus's and said, "Don't let this stop you from loving airplanes. You have something special inside you, and no one can take that away." Marcus smiled faintly. He was grateful for the support of his parents, but he still felt the sting of being misunderstood. He wondered if the pilot had gone home thinking he was right, or if he realized his mistake. The next day, the story began to spread around the airport. The security guard who had recognized Marcus mentioned it to colleagues. Word reached airport staff and even a few local reporters. Soon, people were talking not just about the boy with the notebook, but also about the fact that his father was a senior FAA administrator. David received several calls at work. Some were from colleagues checking on his son. Others were from airport officials wanting to smooth things over. David listened politely to all of them, but he wasn't interested in blame or embarrassment. What he cared about was the bigger picture, how this situation reflected the way people sometimes treated those they didn't understand. A few days later, David and Marcus were invited back to the airport for a meeting. Marcus was nervous as they walked through the familiar terminal, his notebook tucked under his arm like a shield. This time, though, he wasn't alone. His father walked beside him with quiet strength. They were greeted by the airport manager, who welcomed them warmly and apologized for what had happened. The police officers involved were also present, looking more relaxed than they had the day of the incident. And standing slightly apart from the group was the pilot, his expression uncertain. The meeting began with polite introductions. The airport manager thanked David for coming and turned his attention to Marcus. "Young man, I want you to know that you are always welcome here. We want the airport to be a place where dreams can take off, not a place where children feel unwelcome." Marcus nodded shyly. He wasn't sure what to say, so he simply held his notebook a little tighter. Then the pilot stepped forward. His voice was quieter than before, stripped of the confidence he had shown that day. "I owe you an apology," he said, looking directly at Marcus. "I made a mistake. I should have asked what you were doing instead of assuming the worst. I didn't mean to scare you." Marcus blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected the pilot to admit his mistake so openly. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. But his father placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, giving him courage. "It's okay," Marcus said softly. "I just like planes. That's all I was doing." The pilot nodded, his face serious. "And that's exactly how dreams begin. I was once a boy watching planes too. I forgot that for a moment, and I'm sorry." The atmosphere in the room shifted. What had begun as a tense misunderstanding was now turning into a lesson for everyone. David spoke next, his voice steady but warm. "What matters now is that we learn from this. Children like my son are the future of aviation. Instead of pushing them away, we need to welcome them, guide them, and encourage them. Every pilot starts with a dream. Let's never forget that." The room fell quiet as his words sank in. The airport manager nodded firmly. "You're absolutely right. From now on, we'll work on creating programs that connect young people with aviation in a positive way. No child should ever feel unwelcome for being curious." Marcus's eyes widened at the idea. The thought of other children like him being invited to the airport to learn about planes filled him with excitement. Maybe one day, kids wouldn't have to sit nervously by a fence with a notebook. They could be inside the airport, learning and dreaming openly. As the meeting ended, the pilot approached Marcus one more time. He reached into his pocket and handed him a small pin shaped like airplane wings. "Every pilot earns their wings," he said. "Consider this a reminder to keep going. One day, you'll earn the real ones." Marcus accepted the pin with wide eyes, holding it carefully as though it were the most valuable thing he had ever received. For the first time since the incident, he felt not just understood but also supported. On the drive home, Marcus kept the pin in his hand, turning it over and over. "Dad," he said suddenly, "I think I want to start flying lessons as soon as I can. I don't want to wait until I'm older. I want to start now." David smiled at his son's determination. "We'll make it happen," he promised. That evening, Marcus placed the pin on his desk beside the model airplane his father had given him years earlier. He opened his notebook and began writing again, not just tail numbers but also thoughts about what had happened. He realized that even though the experience had been scary, it had also taught him something important. Sometimes, dreams are tested. And when they are, holding on to them matters more than ever. As he looked out his window and saw a plane gliding across the night sky, Marcus whispered softly to himself, "One day, that will be me." And this time, the dream felt closer than ever. The weeks after the airport incident passed quickly, but the memory stayed fresh in Marcus's mind. At first, he wasn't sure how to feel. Part of him still remembered the fear of sitting on the grass with police officers towering over him. Another part remembered the pride he felt when his father arrived and stood up for him. And then there was the moment when the pilot handed him the small pin shaped like airplane wings, a reminder that even mistakes could turn into lessons. Life began to feel normal again. Marcus returned to his routine of school, homework, and his favorite trips to the airport fence. But something had changed. This time, whenever he rode his bike to the spot, he noticed people looked at him differently. Airport workers who used to walk past without a word now sometimes smiled and waved. A security guard even stopped one afternoon to ask about his notebook. "What are you writing today?" the guard asked kindly. Marcus smiled proudly. "The tail numbers. I'm keeping track of which planes come in and out." The guard nodded with interest. "Keep it up, kid. That's how future pilots start." Those small moments gave Marcus confidence. He no longer felt like a boy hiding with a notebook. He felt like a young dreamer who was slowly being recognized. His father often reminded him that respect takes time but always begins with understanding. One Saturday morning, David surprised Marcus with an announcement. "Get ready, son. We're going somewhere special today." Marcus's eyes lit up. "Where?" David smiled mysteriously. "You'll see." They drove for about an hour before arriving at a small flight school near the edge of the city. The sight of tiny planes lined up on the runway made Marcus's jaw drop. His heart pounded as he realized what was happening. Are we flying today?" he asked breathlessly. David laughed warmly. "Not me. You." Marcus's hands shook with excitement as they entered the school. A flight instructor greeted them and explained that Marcus would get to sit in a small training plane and even handle the controls while in the air. It wasn't a full lesson yet, he was still too young for that, but it was a chance to feel what flying was really like. When Marcus climbed into the cockpit, it felt like stepping into a dream. The buttons, dials, and levers surrounded him like treasures in a secret world. The instructor guided him patiently, showing him how to hold the yoke and explaining each step of the takeoff. Marcus listened with wide eyes, absorbing every word. As the plane lifted off, his stomach fluttered, but he grinned from ear to ear. The world below grew smaller, the roads turning into thin lines, the houses into little blocks. For the first time, Marcus wasn't just watching a plane from the ground, he was inside one, looking out from the seat where pilots Saturday go ahead, you've got it, the instructor said, letting Marcus gently steer. Marcus's hands trembled slightly, but he held the controls steady. The plane dipped slightly, then leveled out, gliding smoothly through the air. He laughed out loud, unable to contain his joy. "I'm really flying," he shouted. David, sitting in the back seat, watched his son with pride. The sight of Marcus in the cockpit, glowing with happiness, was a moment he knew he would never forget. When the plane landed and rolled back to the hangar, Marcus climbed out with his face flushed from excitement. He hugged his father tightly. "Thank you, Dad. This is the best day of my life." From that day forward, Marcus's dream grew even stronger. He began reading books not only about airplanes but also about navigation, weather, and flight safety. He asked his father endless questions about how airports operated, and David answered each one with patience. Sometimes they would sit late into the night, discussing everything from the history of aviation to the future of space travel. At school, Marcus's teachers noticed a change too. He was more confident when speaking in class, more eager to share his thoughts. When asked to write an essay about his role model, Marcus chose not a celebrity or an athlete, but his father. He wrote about how his dad worked hard to make flying safe and how he wanted to follow in his footsteps, not by working at a desk but by flying planes himself. Word of Marcus's story continued to spread. A local newspaper published an article about the boy who loved planes and the misunderstanding that turned into an important lesson. The article highlighted how airports could become places of learning, not just places of rules and suspicion. Soon, other children became curious too. Parents began bringing their kids to the airport fence, and Marcus noticed he wasn't alone anymore. Some brought cameras, others brought notebooks, and a few even asked Marcus for tips on how to spot different planes. One afternoon, as he sat by the fence with his notebook, Marcus realized that his experience had created something bigger than himself. It had started a small wave of curiosity, showing others that the sky wasn't out of reach. He smiled as he helped a younger child write down the tail number of a jet. "That's a Boeing 737, Marcus explained proudly. "You'll get better at recognizing them." David watched from a distance, his heart full. He saw how his son had turned a moment of fear into a spark that inspired others. As months passed, Marcus continued his visits to the airport, continued his studies at school, and continued dreaming bigger. The pilot who had once misjudged him even reached out again, offering to let Marcus tour the cockpit of a commercial jet. Standing in the captain's seat, surrounded by the panels and controls of a real airliner, Marcus felt more certain than ever about his future. "Someday," he whispered to himself, "this will be mine." Years would still stand between Marcus and his dream. There would be challenges ahead, tests to pass, lessons to learn, hours upon hours of training. But the boy who once sat nervously on the grass with his notebook now carried with him something stronger, the belief that he belonged in the sky. On quiet evenings, Marcus often sat by his bedroom window, gazing at the stars and the faint blinking lights of planes passing overhead. He thought about the day when he would no longer just watch, but command. He thought about the children who might one day look up at his plane and dream just as he had. The memory of the misunderstanding at the airport never disappeared completely. But over time, it became less of a painful story and more of a reminder that dreams sometimes meet obstacles, but obstacles can become stepping stones. He had learned that patience, courage, and support could turn even the hardest moments into something meaningful. One night, as Marcus prepared for bed, he opened his notebook. The pages were filled with tail numbers, sketches, and notes collected over the years. But this time, he added something new. On the last page, in bold letters, he wrote, "One day, I will fly." And with his father's encouragement, his mother's love, and his own unwavering determination, Marcus knew that the boy with the notebook by the fence was already on his way to becoming the man in the cockpit. The sky was waiting.